I am Eric Halivni, along with Jeffrey Reches, sitting with Jeremy Ben-Ami, talking about his father Yitzchak Ben-Ami, March 2nd, 2018, in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. Why don't we start by, if you could tell me about your father, where he was born, when he was born, if you even knew where his family was from, anything that you could tell me about his background.
Yeah, absolutely. The family origin is in what is today Belarus. And so the parental grandparents, the paternal grandparents for my dad were from outside Vitebsk, and the maternal grandparents were outside Grodno. And they each made their way to Palestine in the 1880s. The paternal side ended up going to Jerusalem, and the maternal side was one of the founding families of Petach Tikva. So it was 1882, and there were 17 families, and his grandparents were one of the founding group that established Petach Tikva.
Do you know their names?
The family name was Yatkovsky, and the father's name in Jerusalem was Rosin. So there are still Rosins and Yatkovskys who were my relatives in Israel, but the family tree is about 500 people now, and it's all sorts of different names and stories. But my father's immediate parents ended up meeting and marrying and living in Jaffa, and my grandfather was a watch repairman, had a store, and just like the typical merchant class, sort of just beginning to move up the economic ladder, the family knew they were going to have children, and just like other people needed more room, and they came together as a housing cooperative to buy some land just north of Jaffa, and that was the founding of the city of Tel Aviv. So my grandparents were one of the 60 families that set up Tel Aviv, and then my father was born in Tel Aviv as one of the first kids in Tel Aviv. So he was born in 1913. The city was founded in 1909, and he grew up and lived in Tel Aviv for his whole childhood. And he went to the Gymnasia, which was the first Hebrew language school of the modern effort to build the state. He studied with Ben Yehuda. It was really, the true pioneer of creating a Hebrew culture and nation. So that's how my father grew up. The family was not particularly political. He grew up in, sort of more standard, at that point, the socialist Zionist, view was sort of the only view. And in his teens, he became a rebel. And he, politically felt that a stronger and harder line was needed, both defensively against attacks against the Jewish community, but really more offensively, to try to create independence. And it wasn't, enough to just go along and get along. So he joined the Beitar and the Etzel, the Irgun, and was actually, very involved with that in the early 30s, and was commander of the Beitar Yerushalayim. He was the head of the youth movement in Jerusalem. And in the late 1930s, he was sent by Menachem Begin and other leaders of the Etzel with 3 or 4 other young Palestinian Jews to Vienna to run the illegal immigration operation that they were spearheading, well ahead of some of the more established groups that were running boats down the Danube. The Irgun was actually the first group to recognize the danger, and so from 37 to 39 he was in Vienna. Then it became too dangerous to stay, and at that point he was assigned to come to the United States, and that's how he ended up here.
Do you know who assigned him? Was it Jabotinsky that was involved, or did he know Jabotinsky?
Yeah, Jabotinsky was still involved with Jabotinsky, and he was actually, Jabotinsky died in New York in 1940, and my father was with Jabotinsky because he was the representative in New York that had been sent here, and so he was with him, sort of staffing him like a young staffer when he died in New York.
Wow.
So it was Jabotinsky, Begin, other of the commanders who made the decision of which of the kids essentially were going to be sent over to the U.S. to represent the Irgun, and the idea was to raise money primarily for continuing the rescue operations out of Europe, but also to fund the ongoing fight that they were having, obviously, for independence at that point still.
So when did your father come to the United States?
It was the fall, I think it was the fall of '39.
Came to New York?
Yeah, he came to New York, set up the office there. There was a man named Hillel Cook, who I assume you've spoken to, Becky Cook, who, if you're looking for the next generation, so Becky's in Ben Gurion University, I think. So Hillel Cook took the American name Peter Bergson, and the group became known as the Bergson Group. And so my dad was part of that original crew of 3 or 4 people.
Do you remember who the other ones were?
Sam Merlin was, very, very, he was sort of the intellectual heart of the group. Peter Bergson and Hillel Cook was sort of the marketing mastermind, and I think my father kept the trains running, and they had a couple of other people who were in and out of the group at different times, but they were the 3 essential players.
And what did they do? What were they trying to do while they were here?
Well, the twin purposes. One, and it's very similar to today. When friends organizations of Israeli initiatives, you try to raise awareness of your cause, so gain publicity and raise money. And that was the cause, was to try to open up the eyes of the American Jewish establishment to what was happening in Europe. That was a very big part of the work in the first few years, because there was just so little willingness to acknowledge just how bad things were about to get. And Jabotinsky was one of the few voices that was out there making the case, that this is about to explode and you have to do something, get everybody out. But because it was Jabotinsky and because it was the right wing, the sort of more left of center establishment shut the doors and didn't, called these folks terrorists and didn't want them included in communal spaces. And so my father was, one of those folks who was just knocking on the doors everywhere, trying to get a hearing and trying to be allowed to explain what's going on. And they took to newspaper ads, and they did Broadway pageants, anything to raise awareness, and then of course raising money for boats, and at different points for different purposes, right? I mean, after the war, it became boats for immigration to, what was hoping soon to be the state, but also for guns and arms. But in the early parts, it was for boats to get Jews out of Europe, anywhere.
What do you know about any of their successes that they had or failures? How did it work for them?
Well, the historical accounts of it at this point, there's been a lot of books written about these efforts, and they give credit to this illegal immigration operation for having saved possibly a couple 100,000 people, which is just an incredible track record. My dad lived with the guilt, the anger for the rest of his life that what he did wasn't good enough, and that there were 6 million who didn't make it. I, continued to honor the success, right? That they did save, if not tens of thousands, maybe even a couple 100,000 people by virtue of the work that they all did. But for my dad, that was not a success. For my dad, the whole thing was a failure, and a failure of the American Jewish community, a failure of the worldwide Jewish community that he continued to, struggle with for the rest of his life.
Because the feeling was that they couldn't manage to persuade.
Right. Yeah, that they weren't able to get folks to realize how desperate the situation was, and people had things that could have been done. If they could have gotten the attention of President Roosevelt and, persuaded him in his feeling, and this is a very common view of the historians who look at this from the political right, let's say, and where my dad was certainly, that there was a real failure on the part of the Jewish establishment in using the access that it had at the White House and in other centers of power, and they didn't use the opportunities to say to the president and to others, you have to act and make this a priority, because the president was, of course, dealing with the question of, can you convince this country to go to war? And there was such a isolationist and anti-war feeling, and it was very hard to persuade to move in that direction. But for the Jewish community, this was, for those who felt that disaster was looming, that should have overweighed any of these other considerations.
And after Pearl Harbor, did that change? Did you know?
There's a lot of accounts about 42, 43. The conferences that were held and the attempts that were made to sound like you were doing something, but in reality nothing was being done. And my father and his group, there were just lots and lots. There's a whole history of the ads that they ran in the New York Times. The Bergson Group, and this is important, like for the history of issue advocacy in this country, the Bergson Group was the first group to ever use the format of a full-page ad in the New York Times to try to get its point across. And so they ran a whole series of hugely provocative ads about Jewish lives for sale, and things that were just shocking, you'd never seen in a newspaper before. And they had Ben Hecht, the playwright, was their ad guy, and writing these ads, and you knew exactly how to get to people, and what emotional buttons to push. So all through that period, trying to just get more attention and more action, and at the same time, what's so interesting is that the Jewish establishment was so angry at these folks, who were rabble-rousers and causing trouble and rocking the boat, and and they kept on trying to shut them down, and they got the IRS to investigate their tax status, and then they got the Selective Service System to draft these guys. So all of these Palestinian-born Jews were drafted into the U.S. Army as an effort to shut them down. Peter Bergson got out with a deferment, a medical deferment, and Sam Merlin had a bad hip or something. My dad was drafted, and he ended up in the U.S. Army as a result of the constant efforts to shut them down. And all of this has been revealed now by, the records and the archives are now open after all these years to see the letters that came into the Justice Department, the State Department, saying, do anything you can to shut these people down. And so they were, it's a fascinating story.
And these letters would come from
from American Jewish establishment groups to try to shut down these rabble-rousing dissidents. So I enjoy that because I'm now a rabble-rousing dissident myself. So I see myself as following in my father's footsteps. So just from a slightly different path,
Did your father? So your father went into the army?
My father fought in World War II for the Americans and got U.S. citizenship out of having been drafted into the U.S. Army to fight in World War II. And he loved, the opportunity to fight against, Germans, right? I mean, one of the many iterations of their work was to raise money for a Jewish army, right? They wanted to get a whole Jewish brigade out of Palestine to go and fight the Germans. So, this was living out what he was saying. So he was more than happy to go and fight, and he went and fought.
Did he go overseas?
Yeah, no, he was in the war. He was in. He was deployed in he fought in the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, he was in the U.S. Army in World War II fighting the Germans.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then he came back after the end of the war.
Right, came back, returned back into the fold of this. This was just an ever-evolving structure of nonprofit, advocacy. 1 year it was this, 1 year it was that. When he came back, I think it was the American League for a Free Palestine. I think that was the name of the group post-World War II. And my dad became the executive director of the American League for a Free Palestine. Essentially the Friends of the Irgun, the American Friends of the Irgun. And so he came back. They had, a very big operation for buying boats, buying arms, and it was all his, network around the country and around the world that was raising this money and bringing the boats. So from about 40, late 45 after the war until 48, that was what he did. And he met a young woman in, one of the volunteers in the office and got married to an American woman. He took American citizenship after the war, having fought in the army. and they had a couple of kids. So he, was becoming a little bit more rooted in the United States post World War II, but still back and forth, all the time. And his final journey was that they bought a boat that was renamed the Altalena. And my father bought the boat and sort of recruited the crew and went with the boat. So my father was on the Altalena when it was blown up, and sadly he lost friends in that attack. And it was after the Altalena attack that my father vowed he was not going to live in Israel under David Ben-Gurion as prime minister. And that was sort of his breaking point when he decided, okay, I'm just going to settle more of my roots in the U.S.
And when were you born?
62.
And the
Different wife, different marriage, That's a whole other story.
were there other? Do you know about any more of the activities? You had mentioned the Broadway.
Right. Right. They did pageants. They did both pageants that were post-war. We Will Never Die is the most famous one, and they toured the country and had sold-out arenas, and Marlon Brando was in it, and it was really they knew how to put on a show. It was mostly Peter Bergson. I mean, that was his genius, but they recruited an incredible array of Hollywood types, right? And Stella Adler, who was the famous acting coach, and she had a whole, her role in building up the stock of Jewish actors and actresses, was amazing. And so she had all these connections, and so she recruited people in, and they got non-Jews like Marlon Brando, and just incredible people to be parts of these pageants.
Who was in the first one was the We Will Never Die, and the other one was The Flag Is
A
Born.
Flag Is Born, exactly.
So I only found out, this is unfortunately the problem, I find out after the fact.
Yeah.
But Stephen Hill, who had played the DA in Law and Order,
Uh-huh.
he was in Flag Is Born.
Really? Oh my goodness, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few people who went on to have,
It was
careers
like
that
a
you
lot of
would,
people, that might have been their first or second
Right.
role of their career.
like Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was a breakthrough thing for him. Not breakthrough, I mean, that's probably overstating it, but,
His first big role. I think.
right, but, for us it was a big role. I don't know if he felt it was a big role.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, these are amazing stories, and that they did this. What I find so amazing is they come to the United States without English, without understanding the United States, without understanding the culture, the politics, and they built out in just a matter of a few years an incredible entertainment, PR, communications, a whole political and lobbying operation. I mean, all of this in the span of like 5 or 6 years, just a handful of guys coming from, pre-state Palestine. It's unbelievable.
Did your father speak any English at the time?
Not before he came here. He spoke multiple languages. He was very good with languages, so it was probably not too hard for him to pick it up. But he spoke Hebrew, Yiddish, Arabic, Italian. He studied in Italy for a couple of years, but he didn't speak English. And so he came here and he learned English relatively quickly. But yeah, they were. This was not an easy thing. They were all in their 20s. Not a lot of worldly sophistication. My father had studied agriculture, and comes here and does this.
What was his name before Ben-Ami?
Rosin.
And when did he change his name?
It was in the years when he was part of Beitar, and the British police were after him, and they all took, fighting names, and so son of my people, Ben-Ami. That was, pretty typical for the. He had a number of different aliases, as I've come to understand, though. He had Ben Menachem, because his father was Menachem, so he was also Yitzhak Ben Menachem. There was another name I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but he had like 4 or 5 different aliases.
And then he stayed in the United States after...
Right, so, for at least the first few years, he was married, had a couple of kids, but that marriage didn't work, and he ended up relocating to Paris for a couple of years, and that's where he met my mom. My mom was a refugee from Vienna, who ended up in London. And then she fled her parents in the early 50s and ended up in Paris. And so my father and my mother met, of all places, in Paris. And one of the things that I love about the story is that my mother's family was sort of a typical Viennese, Jewish family from the aristocracy, right? And not particularly Jewish and very assimilated and nothing can happen to us kind of attitude, right? And there's so many stories like this, right? So 38 comes around and they're, all desperately trying to get out. These really rich, connected, powerful people, and they're desperate to get out. And my father is in charge of the office of the Irgun that's figuring out who's going to be able to get on their limited number of boats. So when he's in Vienna, having come from Palestine, right, as again, at that point he's 27, and, no money. The family was poor farmers that had just begun to, work their way out of Petach Tikva, right? And he's in Vienna figuring out which of these rich, powerful families are going to actually get out. Now, my mother and father didn't meet then, but I love the fact that they crossed paths at that, moment in history, and then they came back together, and they actually got together in Paris in the 50s.
What was he involved with after the founding of the State of Israel? What did he?
Well, it's interesting, the connections of these folks who did the boats and the arms dealing and international trade, it came very natural to them to then go into international commerce. And so a lot of them were in commodities trading, right? And they had people in Paris and in Shanghai and here and there and all over the world. And so my father spent his professional career in commodities trading, but actually in the, not like on Wall Street selling futures, right? But actually like arranging the boats and the shipments and, all of that sort of stuff. So that was his thing. And they used the contacts of the people that they had done this with during the war and after the war. So that's, he was in business.
I interviewed somebody, Eli Shalit, who also, he had been a part of the whole operation here in the States, shipping in the acquisitions of weapons and supplies and things like that. And he went on to a career in shipping also.
Right,
because,
right. It's a natural, they had all these connections and sort of knew the basics of that business, and they had connections, right? And they knew each other. And my father stayed very, very active in, the politics of Israel, even though he never again went to live. In fact, I don't think that he was ever, quote unquote, a citizen of the State of Israel, right? His birth certificate is Ottoman Palestine, right? He ended up under British rule, but I don't think, because of his decision not to, be a citizen under Ben Gurion, I don't think he ever actually took citizenship. And so when I would go, we'd go all the time as a family to visit, and when we would land, his passport would say he was born in Tel Aviv. But he didn't have a Teudat Zehut, right? He didn't have a number. He wasn't in the system. And it always, every time at the airport, they couldn't compute. Like, how could you have been born in Tel Aviv, but you're not actually in our system, right? You're not in Israel, and you don't have a number. You're not an Israeli citizen. It didn't never computed for them. So it's a very interesting little twist.
And in 77, when Begin came to power, any change in his?
It was huge. It was such a great, celebration and excitement. I mean, my father they had friends organizations here, like American Friends of Beirut. So my father was one of the founders of that, and he had a radio show called Beirut USA, and he wrote a book, and he was on the talk show circuit. He had a weekly column in the Jewish press. I mean, my father was definitely a presence in the 60s, 70s, and until he died in 1984, for that period in the growing arguments among American Jews about all of this. He was a real presence on the right wing, and I still, there's still some younger people who are now in their 60s and 70s, but they were young then, who are now, fairly prominent on the West Bank, and prominent leaders in Israel who grew up in Brooklyn and grew up in New York City who remember my dad and give me a very hard time today, over how could you be, Yitzhak Ben Ami's son and doing what you're doing. And I say it's precisely because I'm his son that I'm doing what I'm doing. So that's an interesting argument. But, he was quite a figure in all of that with the columns and the radio shows. And so he was thrilled when Begin won. Then comes Camp David and the Sinai. And for my father, who was an unrepentant right-wing on the nationalist front. I mean, the idea of ever giving any land back to anyone for any reason was, just a mistake strategically. And so he was devastated that Menachem Begin would have done this, and he really never forgave him for that. And it was a real falling out between them personally.
Had they stayed in contact?
Oh yeah, they were in very close contact, and the whole circle around Begin, basically was the same circle from the 40s, right? I mean, a lot of these people had just stayed involved for 30 years, and they were in their 20s in the 40s, and now they were in their 50s or 60s, right? And now they came to power, and this was my father's friends, in that whole era for 15 years, and so they had celebrations. They celebrated. There was some sort of Jabotinsky celebration. I don't know if it was his centennial. In the 70s, and my father got a Jabotinsky medal, and Begin gave it to him. He was definitely in that circle, and so when this happened, it was a real falling out between them.
Do you remember any of these people when you were growing up coming by, or any contact with any of them?
Oh, sure, yeah. No, I mean, this, our living room was like. Whenever anybody was in New York, our living room was the place to come, and Sam Merlin ended up living in New York too, and so Merlin and my father, would sort of host any of these folks that came through. Begin came through all the time. Another person who was often in the mix was Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who was another close friend of this grouping, and there's just a whole range of them that he was in touch with.
Yechiel Kadishai.
Yes, yeah. He was his chief of staff, right? It was Begin's. Yeah, that was a very close. I think the one person who's still remaining, who still remembers my dad from that kind of an era, is Moshe Ahrens. I think he's in his 90s now, but he was like a real young kid in all of that. But when I've been in Israel, he still remembers my dad. But there's not a lot of folks left at this point.
You were saying how your involvement is precisely because of I'm curious how.
Well, I really do view my connection to this as a link in the chain, and I think that there's a similarity. I've talked a bit to Tzipi Livni about this, because her dad and my dad were very similar and not close friends, but they knew each other, and the Meridor family, some of my dad's best friends, the brothers. But there's this sense that your parents, that was their entire life, was fighting to try to secure and achieve this incredible miracle of the state of Israel, and yet it feels like the work isn't quite done. And my interpretation of it is what's lacking at this point is the final borders of the state of Israel. And to be able to take out a map and draw with a pencil what the actual international border is, and to have it recognized by the world, right? Then you've really got your state. Then the work is done. So I view it as we still have some unfinished work. That my great grandparents were these pioneers coming with nothing from the Pale and going to a swamp and creating Petach Tikva and all these other cities, or my grandparents building the modern state in Tel Aviv as part of the original founders, my dad fighting for the state. So I view this as a link in a chain, and that the role, for my view of this generation, which is obviously different from the way that others view it at this point, but my view is you've got to figure out how to get along with your neighbors. You're not going to be able to defeat them, and they're not going to defeat you. And if you want to just not fight for the rest of eternity, then you've got to figure out how to get along. And I view that as the the challenge for this generation, and the work that I try to promote in my current role is to figure out a way to get to that. So I see it as the continuation, though I come at it from a different politics. I come at it from a different place on the spectrum. What we're doing is we're sort of trying to shake up the establishment view of things, and that's precisely what my father was doing. That the establishment of the American Jewish community in the 20s and 30s into the 40s had a certain political leaning and had a certain view of how to get where it was going, and my father thought they were wrong. And so he just didn't hesitate to just call it out and try to fight. And now really his point of view is in the ascendancy, in the establishment, right, which is more right of center today. And I feel that the path that we're on is not the right path. And so I'm trying to shake things up a little bit. So I view it as parallel, although obviously not in tune with each other.
What do you think your father's greatest accomplishment or contribution was?
Well, I don't know how to judge all the various different pieces. It's impossible for me to imagine being in Vienna in 1938 and trying to just help people get out, and to know that just out of that little operation, they had 20,000 people get out in Vienna in the 2 years that he was there. And so you've directly saved lives. So it's hard to top that, right? But there's so much else in the, helping in the creation of the state and trying to carve a different path and to show people a different way to go. And so there's just so much. But probably just saving lives is the most important thing.
You said there was this frustration. Did the frustration extend beyond the cause of trying to save Jews during the Holocaust, or were there other frustrations that he felt, or is it these things all wrapped up in each other? Or?
They really are all wrapped up. I think it was, fundamentally, came down to a resentment that people who had the opportunity to do something didn't do something. It always came back to that same issue, that there were things that could have been done, and there were people with the power to do them, and they just didn't do it. And every argument, literally every single night, in our living room with whoever was there, was about what could have been done. And that continued for 30 to 40 years. There was a fair amount of argument over the Altalena too, and how wrong Ben Gurion was, but put that aside, but I think it was much more the frustration at, at the establishment for not doing enough.
Did he talk about the Altalena?
Oh yeah. Yeah, he wrote a book. I think I've got the book on the shelf there down at the bottom, and he wrote all about all of these things that I've laid out. I'll show you the book. But he wrote all about it.
And he never got over that.
No. No, it's understandable.
I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was 35. I've always tried to relate myself at various ages to where he was at. So he was 35 on the deck of the Altalena, right? And had done all these other things, and he was only 35, which is just amazing, right? And he died at 71. So he had the first half of his life led to the Altalena, and the second half was what happened after. And it's as if the second half of his life was spent in the shadow of that moment, and always arguing about the first 35 years. It was always, and that has its negatives. That was hard, I think, for him and for the family, but it was always returning back to the same arguments, and you just couldn't get past it.
How would you like your father to be remembered?
Well, the first word that always comes to my mind is a hero. I really think, and it's an unsung hero. He's not a story that people do not know his name, people don't know his saga, but he was a hero. And you know, and the things they did, and it's not just him, but that whole crew, you know, the Bergson Group story, they keep trying to make movies about it. They keep trying to, there was a play, Bernie Weinrib did a play. He was a New York Times journalist who found out about this and then wrote a play because it was so spectacular. And it just never quite makes it into the public realm, this story. But, you know, this is really, truly epic stuff.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. I love to share the story.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
In terms of heroes, your father and the rest of the Bergson Group, it's just it really blows my mind. Just
Right.
to think about, for me, part of getting into this whole thing was trying to imagine if I were living at that time, what would I have done?
Right.
And would I have had the mettle, the temerity to think that you could show up
Right.
here in the United States, and you're just a few people, and
Right.
you're just going to change everything,
Right.
take on the entire establishment.
Right. You have to have absolutely no knowledge of what you're doing in order to have that kind of guts.
Yeah.
Because if you actually understood what you were trying to do, you'd realize it was impossible and you would never try it.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was like bungee jumping, but without the cord, right? You know, just assuming that there'd be a net down there. And they just leapt off and they did it. And, you know, I think they made a difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I'll show you the book.
Thank you.
But that's him. The lovely shorts. Yeah, there's as a young man. See, in the beginning, he was part of the Zionist Socialist Youth Movement. That was
Right.
his, you know, the origins, and then he broke. Celebrating Ben Yehuda's birthday in 1935. The former students going back to celebrate with him. There's my dad. Students in Tel Aviv, so he would have been 18 here, so just a high school senior, and that's probably the gymnasia in the background. So yeah, no, this is just incredible stuff, and you know, just not known enough. Of course, my father has his take on Dear Yassin.
Yeah, what do you say about that? But he was
Not a peaceful village.
but he was here.
Yes, he was not part of that. That's
Right.
just his take on it.
We've been focusing at this point on trying to get as many of these interviews as we
Right.
can, but the next stage is to make them available so that people can use them for
Right.
research and education and films. And I'll just give you here's just a sense, if you want to. The idea has been to get, it's a not political project, to try to get a whole range of the stories. I was thinking about Yehuda Avner. We interviewed Uri Avneri. Yehuda Avner. Yehuda Avner wrote a book just before he died. It was a historical fiction book. It wasn't you said made me think of it, where he imagined that what if the state of Israel